and it's a day that was traumatic for a lot of folks. What I try to remind people is that was outside the norm of human experience. I mean, the brutality, I think, is important for folks to truly understand.
This can't be allowed. We're watching in real time people scaling the wall of the Capitol. We're watching them breaking down doors and going through windows, and we're watching, people being hurt and the way the police were being treated.
I did wonder whether I was going to make it out of there. Many of us who were trapped in the gallery actually called our families.
As a reminder, on the afternoon of January 6th, the president called what was happening at the Capitol then an unprecedented assault on our democracy and an attempt to subvert our Constitution and interfere with the peaceful transfer of power. So on Thursday, the president is going to speak to the truth of what happened, not the lies that some have spread since, and the peril it has posed to the rule of law and our system of democratic governance.
My first guest tonight is Ian Bremmer. He's president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Ian is one of the world's leading risk assessors. He joins me from New York City. Ian, it's good to have you back on the program. Happy New Year to you. I want to ask you about the January 6th anniversary in just a moment. But first, you and I, we've done this New Year's dance now for several years. So tell me, at the start of 2022, what condition is our world in?
Well, I'll start with a little good news, because we've had 2 years of all being so disrupted by the pandemic. I've never felt so optimistic about both sides of the Atlantic being able to get through this and live with the virus, moving it towards endemic. And that's because this wave of Omicron comes with a lot fewer hospitalizations, a lot fewer deaths. We've got much better therapeutics that the wealthy world is going to be able to roll out in very short order, and we have a lot more vaccines and boosters. So that's good news, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. But globally, the most powerful country in the world is, of course, also the most politically divided of the major democracies, the most economically unequal of the G7, and the least vaccinated. All that's self-inflicted. And the relationship with China, of course, not just the U.S., but the advanced industrial democracies, really problematic. There's no trust at all. There's not a lot of alignment. And the Chinese are experiencing a lot of their own problems at home. And their problems with the pandemic are going to get a lot worse this year. So the backdrop geopolitically is pretty tough.
Yeah, your top risk for 2022 is China's zero COVID policy. Why is that?
Well, it's so interesting that back in 2020, once the Chinese admitted that they had human-to-human transmission, they were very quickly the most effective in responding to COVID of all the major governments out there. Why? Because they could surveil, they could track, they could trace, they could quarantine, and they could lock down, stop the cases from spreading. But we all know with Omicron, you don't want to focus on cases, you want to focus on hospitalizations and deaths. But the Chinese government's still focusing on cases. And very few Chinese have gotten COVID, so they don't have antibodies. And their vaccines don't work well against Omicron spread. So if they're trying to keep zero COVID in place, it's going to get harder and harder. More and more of China will be locked down. That's going to hurt their economy. It's also going to hurt their ability to be a part of the global supply chain. We see now some of their ports are already starting to get disrupted because millions and millions of people are locked down for small numbers of cases. That's going to get harder over the course of 2022.
And Ian, don't you think, though, that we here in the West, particularly in the media, are we also guilty of focusing too much on the number of cases instead of the severity of those cases?
Well, look, I mean, this is a pandemic that has changed shape dramatically, and it takes us a while to learn. So, yes, I think that we're guilty of that, but I understand why. I mean, a couple of years ago, we were saying if you touch your face, you could die from COVID. If you don't, sanitize your vegetables and your groceries coming in, you could eat and die, right? I mean, so we just didn't know where this thing came from. And the fact is that if Omicron had hit the world before we had vaccines and therapeutics a year earlier, this would have felt much more apocalyptic, and we'd still be focusing on cases very intelligently. But when you have the ability to stop people from going into the hospital, when you have the ability to treat people that get COVID, especially in countries like Germany and the United States, you stop focusing on cases. We've got to pivot quickly to focusing on hospitalizations and deaths. Those gaudy case numbers, which are probably vastly understated, are coming with much fewer hospitalizations. The UK is ahead of the United States, and we already see the peak there. I think this is actually very good news for most of the planet.
The world's strong arm leaders, all the way from Brazil's Bolsonaro to Russia's Putin, they are, if you will, misbehaving, and they're getting away with more and more. The political scientist Francis Fukuyama, he mentioned this today in an op-ed piece for the New York Times. I'm going to show a quote from what he wrote. He said, before January 6th, these kinds of antics would have been seen as the behavior of young and incompletely consolidated democracies, and the United States would have wagged its finger in condemnation. But it has now happened in the United States itself. America's credibility in upholding a model of good democratic practice has been shredded. Now, why do I fear that you think that the upcoming midterm elections in November are going to do nothing to change that assessment?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, you actually said in the opening, you said that what happened in January 6th was seared into our collective consciousness. And I want to take issue with you because I know it feels that way outside the United States, but in my own country, there is no collective consciousness. There are two completely different stories. 9/11, after 9/11, the entire country every year said never again. January 6th, most Americans think it is going to happen again. And some of them think it's a good thing. Some of them don't. I mean, the dynamic in the United States has been learning absolutely no lessons over the course of the last year. And whether or not you believe the election was fundamentally stolen and that the people that went into the Capitol building were patriots who were trying to ensure that a legitimate election of Donald Trump, which is fake news, was not going to be overthrown, I mean, frankly, those people are seen to be patriots by a majority of Republicans in the United States. Donald Trump controls the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is increasingly on the other side of everything. And frankly, increasingly, not just do a majority of Americans believe that democracy in crisis, but they think that their fundamental enemy is on the other side of the political aisle in their own country. And I will tell you that for democracies where that is true, they don't last well for very long.
Yeah. There's a new poll that shows the majority of Americans expect a similar event to the January 6th riot to happen again soon. And a majority of Americans also say that they now do not trust the government, state or federal, anymore. I want to connect that to some images. I'm sure you saw the images of motorists stranded in a snowstorm along Interstate 95 in Northern Virginia at the beginning of the week. It's a main travel artery in the United States along the eastern seaboard. Some people were in their cars for 24 hours. Also, they were stranded in an Amtrak train. Just take a listen to what one traveler said.
Snowstorms happen all of the time in this area, and that we just had protocol for snowstorms, and that this type of backup issue wouldn't happen because we would be able to clear it better, faster. So I thought, it's 2022. We got everything under control. Dangerous train rides don't happen anymore.
Well, I mean, she's wrong about that, Ian. I mean, this looks like it's clearly a case of the government failing the people, not doing the basics, clearing roads in the snow, but also not even able to pass a budget. Moving into 2022, are we seeing American democracy unraveling before our very eyes?
$1.3 trillion being spent on infrastructure, something the U.S. has been overdue at passing for decades now, will make a difference. So I don't want to underestimate that. And also, I want to point out that the American economy is very robust. As you know, the stock market keeps hitting record levels. Unemployment levels are going down. New jobs are being created. Some of the most entrepreneurial companies and technologies in the world are coming out of the United States. U.S. percentage of global GDP is roughly what it was 20 years ago. Europe's gone down, declined. Japan's gone down, declined. China's gone up. U.S. hasn't moved. So, I mean, it's not like U.S. power is going away, but U.S. democracy is eroding significantly. the legitimacy of U.S. political institutions, the lack of equality of opportunity, the lack of mobility of members of the working and middle class, the ennui that's being felt, for example, by undereducated white men who feel correctly that they're losing status in a country that will be majority non-white by 2045. These are deep structural issues that are not being addressed as the wealthy get wealthier and the most powerful country in the world continues to move apace. That's a real problem.
Ian Bremmer helping us put the risk facing the U.S. and the world in 2022 in perspective. Ian, it's always good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
You too, man. Be good.